Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we're going to be talking about the sophomore album from Let's Eat Grandma called I'm All Ears. So this is going to be a bit of a strange record to cover, and this time I don't have any excuses. I put this on my schedule myself when I started seeing the critical acclaim rolling in. And I will freely admit that when I discovered this was an indie pop duo from the UK who met as children and started reportedly writing these strange, off-kilter little songs, I thought I had a firm idea of what I was getting into, and after listening to their debut Gemini, well, I still think I kind of do, but that's more because the weird kaleidoscope of sounds that Let's Eat Grandma incorporates does make a strange sort of sense. Yes, the obvious comparisons can be made to the dream pop scene with the spacey textures and the extended song structures that all go on way too long, but the more obvious comparison was a subgenre that I have not talked about in a long time. Anti-folk. I mean, you know the types, the ones that take the more earnest songwriting tropes of folk music and then bend them until they snap. And considering how much of their debut read like an extended, slightly twisted subversion of fairy tales, and how much modern pop has disappeared up its own ass in the 2010s, even in the mainstream, Let's Eat Grandma was pretty intriguing, generally enjoyable to talk about, but not particularly gripping, at least for me. A good debut, but not quite a great one. But that debut Gemini, mostly comprised of songs that the girls had written in their younger years, it did get a lot of attention, including from experimental pop producer Sophie, who keeps showing up in my reviews this past month. And given that she was stepping in alongside David Wrench as production, made me think that I'm All Ears might be a bit of a sonic departure for the girls, heading towards more glittery synth pop than the anti-folk that gave Let's Eat Grandma such a distinctive presence in the UK indie pop scene. But hey, considering all the critical acclaim with this album, I was certainly curious, so alright, what do we find on I'm All Ears? Well, honestly, I think I might fall on the cooler side with regards to this project as I did with their debut. I'm not quite as crazy as everybody is on this. And believe me, I went in really wanting to get on board with Let's Eat Grandma, but the more listens I gave I'm All Ears, the more I'm convinced that their pivot towards more synth pop not only sapped out some of the band's unique energy off of Gemini, but also it hasn't taken a step towards resolving the frustrations that I had with that debut album. And yet, I would hesitate to call this a sophomore slump because, like with Charlie XCX and Pop 2, I can definitely see many of the artistic choices made here reflect a direction that will likely satisfy their fan base and just didn't really click for me. And even then, I would still call this a pretty enjoyable listen. It's a good album, if not quite a great one. And the weird thing about that is that somehow I think some of the things that I like and appreciate about I'm All Ears, they will most likely run contrary to what other people like in the fan base. And the lyrics, they're a very good place to start. Because on a purely superficial level, the poetry is not quite as elegant or nakedly subversive or off-kilter as Gemini. And while we do get passages with some richer detail, more of the content, it would not be that far removed from your average indie synth pop act like, say, Carly Rae Jepsen. And while the part of me that really liked the anti-folk subversion of their debut, the poetry around this time feels, if not as clever, more heartfelt and more personal. And while there is always a slightly childlike sense of framing to their work, it's more acutely adolescent for I'm All Ears. And I intend that as a compliment, believe it or not, especially in the emotional nuances that come with some of those high school years. And yes, there can be nuance there. And that's not to be dismissed as it so often is. Truly great teen pop knows how to bury into those frustrating emotional contradictions on the cusp of maturity, whereas the lesser material or just the bad teen pop simply echoes or panders to it. And if Let's Eat Grandma has a skill, it's getting into the headspace of unanswered yearning, the stifled emotions to try to appear cool, or the slow realization that sometimes no matter how straightforward the solution might seem to your mind, the larger adult consequences, they rarely are. It's one reason I found the self-conscious anxiety on the cusp of falling in love on Falling Into You and I Will Be Waiting to be surprisingly charming and wistful. And as much as I have issues with Cool and Collected that I will get to, I appreciate the curdled tension that lies within the deeper song. And hell, when you consider how thematically this record is about bucking against the conventional norms to stifle that greater emotionality, the choice to end things with Donnie Darko and showing both a hyper-detailed stagnation and the fear that opportunities to try to express something might have already been missed in the past, that's really potent, especially following after Ava, an easy high point on this album, and how for as much as the protagonist wants to be a support for that broader expression of emotional truth, the older titular character pushes back because, when you're an adult with responsibilities and real consequences, it is so much harder to just lay everything out there. And I really like how Let's Eat Grandma, they do not dance around some of those larger consequences, especially on my favorite song here, Snakes and Ladders, which takes a relationship where the protagonist feels kind of neglected and unneeded, and then drives it straight into the curdled nightmare of toxic codependence that it could very well become if both were forced to need each other. And the framing does not shy away from that either, and I really dug how dark that song was ultimately willing to get in the lyrics. So alright, the writing and themes are remarkably on point. They show a great deal of nuance and balance, so why isn't this project great for me again? Well, this is where we have to get into the execution, and unfortunately this comes in two parts. The first major issue is unfortunately a carryover from iGemini, and that is the structure. Out of 11 songs, 3 are instrumental introductions or interludes. And while I appreciated the juxtaposition of the thicker, ragged strings against the twinkling keys and the warping electronics on the opener of Whitewater, I honestly wish we had more of those strings. They sounded really good. The oddly jaunty synth of Miss Call 1, it utterly deflates the tension coming off of Snakes and Ladders, and the super close purring and mouth noises of Cat's Pajamas was entirely too close for me for comfort, and doesn't really fit after the glittery outro of I Will Be Waiting. And that's not even counting on how by the time we get to the final 3 songs, 2 of which clock over 9 minutes by doubling down on the loop synth progressions with added layers of smoldering guitar, and while Donnie Darko does come kinda close to earning its length thanks to the coursing 80s synth pop groove that finally comes in, that's followed by a really potent climax near the 8-minute mark, Cool and Collected just feels overlong and kinda stilted with some of the pluckier elements. Now that's a case I'd make for a fair few songs here, with extended passages that are crying out for any sense of deeper momentum or groove, or even writing to add a lot more meat to these songs, but lacking the progressive melodic shifts or the layering to really get there. We're left with decent cuts, but really just shying away from greatness. And yes, some of this is trying to cultivate that more spacey, meditative dream pop vibe, but that takes us to the second major issue, and that is instrumental focus for Let's Eat Grandma as a whole. Because while I can respect how much they will try for cohesion, it's kind of hard to ignore that the 2 songs produced and co-written by Sophie, Hot Pink and It's Not Just Me, they can feel overwhelmed by the blown out glassy edges and the grainy trap touches, and with the absence of the folk elements, it can feel like the duo is kind of struggling for a more distinctive identity away from Sophie. You can definitely tell she produced those songs and kind of at their expense. The comparison I found kind of apt, given the girlish vocals and odd juxtaposition of genres on the rest of the album. It was Elvia Dulcimer, who I reviewed way back in 2015, and also had a similar pop, folk, rock, electronic fusion, but Let's Eat Grandma seems to have stripped the pop down to synth tones ranging from 90s R&B to 80s rock, with more than a few sidelong glances at the most recent War on Drugs album, and then a grungier but accessible set of 90s guitar tones. And while the duo's credit, they do give their disparate influences enough space to avoid a lot of dramatic clash or pile-up, but when you realize that most of the programmed percussion work is generally pretty thin, and many of the songs are lacking that coursing bass foundation, one reason I like Snakes and Ladders so much is that it had it, it further detracts from the momentum that the longer songs they desperately need. And more to the point, you have to wonder whether or not a more conventional melodic climax would make songs like It's Not Just Me or Falling Into You hit so much harder, as the duo seems very much aware how to ramp up the tension and the texture, but not that moment to really cut the melody loose and really just soar. And if all this kind of reads like me just crying out for a striking instrumental guitar solo or synth solo to loosen things up and maybe match the rougher exuberance of the teenage vocals, well yeah it is, but tell me I'm wrong here, that could be awesome! But as a whole, alright look, there are parts of me that wants to simultaneously be easier and harder on this project. Because Let's Eat Grandma has a ton of promise, and their willingness to experiment across the board is really encouraging. There aren't that many acts that really sound like them with this sound right now, even with the Step Square's conventional synth pop. But there are niggling tendencies in their song construction that could be better executed, and the last thing I want to see is this duo get their unique tones co-opted by other producers with a more defined sound before they can iron out all the kinks and they just get lost in the shuffle. And all that means, I'm giving I'm All Ears an extremely light 7 out of 10 and a recommendation, but a bit of a cautious one. Again, this is a duo whose hype is blowing up very quickly, and I want to hear them ride out the wave and not get subsumed by all of it. But you know what? Hearing them mature, it really is kind of interesting. This album certainly was more compelling than I was expecting, so yeah, you know what? Check it out. It's cool stuff. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. I'm a little surprised how much I had to say about this, but also given the critical acclaim and somewhat of the cult following I'm already seeing, just be nice in the comments. They're down below. If you want to buy the record, it's also linked in my description, and I got the poll up there for y'all to tell me how wrong I am. Looking forward to it. Beyond that, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. And if you guys want to get involved in my scheduling process or help support this channel, link to my Patreon is right over there, where 3 times a week you guys get to vote on my schedule, and once a week for the higher tier contributors, you guys get to add albums, movies, or even a top 10 list to that schedule. More details right over there. If you want to see my schedule, it's on my Instagram, link down there below. Until then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.